that's gone and thank you, and what they're trying to do now. So I think this is, will be of interest to us all and has quite a bit of social importance. So please join me in welcoming Carlos Pereira.
Thank you everybody in the room and online. Thank you. So I'm particularly pleased to be here because of a number of reasons. First, it's a long time since I've not been, to be honest, in the Bay Area and in Oakland. So coming back, there is this factor always. It happens that a number of friends, and particularly one important colleague in the Club of Rome, actually lives here in Oakland, Mathis Wegernagel, and I will mention him later. But also I'm particularly interested in understanding better this moment for you, for your institution or institutions becoming one, Northeastern University and Mills College, and how you are working around the role of humanities connected to sustainability, because this is an untypical approach. Until now, this is not the Club of Rome approach resonates very much with what I've understood you are trying to do from what Tim told me, as you will see. But this is untypical because to a large extent, we address issues, social issues in siloed ways, and in particular separate environmental issues from social issues. This is exactly the opposite of what the Club of Rome is doing, as you can see from the slogan we adopted 2 years ago, Global Equity for a Healthy Planet, saying, well, you know what happens? You cannot separate social and environmental issues. They're both. There are sides of a multifaceted challenge that humanity is facing, but they are intimately connected. And you cannot separate the perspective, or you cannot address environmental issues are often reduced to climate change and addressed from the perspective of natural sciences, which of course are very much needed. And we work with some leading prominent climate scientists. Some of them are members of the club as well. But we don't see that as natural scientists have to say what is happening and how to solve it. And then humanities and social sciences have the role of convincing people that that has to be done. We think actually the humanities side of this is essential, as I will explain. And it's because it's not a disciplinary issue. It's not something we can keep within one discipline. It requires all of them at the same time and many different threads of knowledge at the same time. And also psychology, Christy, because this is also connected. What we are going to discuss is so connected with our perception of who we are and our place in the world, epistemology, if you wish. But so then it makes a lot of sense for me to be here at this very moment with you and to understand better what you have in mind and what you are doing together now, Northeastern University with Mills College. So I could speak during hours. I will try to not to speak during hours, but I still need to make this progress. So not sure how to do that. Sorry, the tech component.
Try the clicker.
Yeah, now, yeah, okay. Thank you. So drop of history of the Club of Rome, which is a very, very untypical organization. I'm not sure there is anyone like us. an unidentified flying object, if you wish, created by a series of coincidences, which would give for another talk, and probably there are some people working on creating a TV series, a fiction TV series about the onset of the Club of Rome. One of the factors was this outstanding personality, Aurelio Peccei, a businessman, an Italian businessman, who lived across the 20th century, died in 1984. A very important personality in the business domain. He started almost a century ago the business of Fiat in China. And that, together with other missions, gave him a perspective of the whole world when it was not so usual to have that perspective. You know, globalization was not even a concept, or the globalization we know now. Of course, there had been a first globalization, if you wish, in the end of 19th century. So he had this global perspective, but he was also very deeply a humanist. And you know, his curriculum is surprising, you know, to what extent he was involved in so many things, including being a resistance fighter during fascism and Nazism in Italy. He was jailed and tortured. And so this is not the typical life of a business person. And I think that brought to him this particular willingness of, you know, of reconnecting with the nothing humane is alien to me, you know. And due to a series of coincidences, a speech he gave in 1965 in Buenos Aires about the challenges of the last third of the 20th century, led him to meet a number of people and ultimately to create the Club of Rome. You can see here with this, you know, identification of the challenges that actually all of them are still alive. If you look at that speech, the vocabulary, some of the words are different now, for sure, but the topics are very much the same. And he was already proposing, and we need to think about that as one thing, not as a multiplicity of issues which are separated from each other. So that is the DNA still today of the Club of Rome, you know, to adopt this perspective at the same time. I would say all scales at the same time. Now that we have a movie, an Oscarized movie, you know, saying everything at the same time everywhere, right? Well, in 1968, the Club of Rome was trying to adopt this perspective of all scales, meaning global and local, short-term and long-term. And what was at the time unique or not so often practiced was the global and long-term, you know, and it's even from the point of view of the time scale, it's even worse today. But I would say what is really unique in the perspective is this idea of everything is connected with everything else. You know, this systemic perspective, the interdependencies, the focus on life is based on relationships, and every of the challenges we are identifying and defining and trying to put them into boxes, well, every one of those challenges is actually connected with everyone else, you know. And that led the Club of Rome to define what we call in our jargon the world problematic, and we are still there. I would like to add that the club started with a very peculiar culture of being a space for debate, very open space. So Aurelio used to say, we are a non-organization which does not take positions, which is a little bit of a trick, of course, because by defining an agenda of topics we would like to address, of course, we were already taking a position, and especially when saying, you know, the systemic perspective, that's a position. But besides that very open framework, we have today many different people in the club. I will come back to that later, with very different opinions on the different issues, which is not trivial to manage, but it gives the club a real richness because it was conceived as an open space for debate. Even the reports are not reports by the Club of Rome, but to the Club of Rome. You know, so we are using our capacity to convene people to say something, to write reports which can be accepted by the Club of Rome, but to increase, to enrich that space of debate. So, of course, we became famous because of this book. The story of his book is interesting in itself, but I will not go into the details. Let me just say that I think if I am asked what does the Club of Rome, what is our mission, I usually say in a very simple sentence, when we are good, we ask better questions. Not more than that, but not less, you know. Asking better questions is, in a way, the questions which reveal our blind spots, or blind spots. The blind spots, of course, can be voluntary blind spots. In Spain, we have a saying that the worst blindness is that of people who don't want to see, you know. And so better questions to reveal blind spots. And we had at the time a big blind spot on the consequences. And Aurelio and others and the group of founders of the Club of Rome had this intuition that, oh, there might be, yes, they were living at the time where in Western Europe and North America, the 3 decades after the Second World War were decades of economic expansion, but also of creation of the welfare state, etc. So it looked like for part of the world, small part actually, but for the part of the world in which they were living, things looked pretty good. And the level of social cohesion was also much higher than today, you know. So why worry, you know, because everything was going good. But they had the intuition that, oh, this might not work forever, and this might not work for most of the world, for the whole world, and then it matters. And then the question that was asked by that book was, does prosperity lead to collapse, or could prosperity lead to collapse? And it had a lot of success. It sold millions of copies. We don't even know exactly how many. Some estimates are in the range of 13 to 30 millions of copies for something which is actually not a thriller. I mean, it's a really interesting book, but not the kind of one you know, which sells normally so many copies. And it created a lot of controversy. And it made the Club of Rome known until today, for good and bad. It created, yes, a lot of support and a lot of, I think it created awareness on the topic. I will go into details on the topic, but it created a lot of backlash as well. Particularly from the perspective that, you know, but growth is, we can go on with economic growth endlessly, you know, especially from the economic perspective. And I'm not talking of the so-called neoliberal school, but many schools in economics didn't have this question in their minds about the limitations of economic growth, you know. And so it created a lot of backlash, and including, you know, the most, the funniest of that, which is that before conspiracy theories were so popular, we became part of one, you know, the conspiracy theory being that we are part of the hidden government of the world. If you were expecting to meet one person of the hidden government of the world, sorry to disappoint you, we are not that, but some people still believe, you know, that we are. But overall, that success failed to change the world, change the course of the world. In a way, depending on what you look at, if you look at in terms of what was the impact and the awareness it contributed to create on socio-ecological issues, yes, it was successful. If you think in terms of changing the course, it didn't work. And changing the course to do what, or to avoid what? In my view, in my interpretation, The Limits to Growth was actually a book. I mean, the attitude, and I know well, some of the authors are still alive, Dennis Meadows and Jorgen Randers. Unfortunately, the leading author, Donella Meadows, died a long time ago. But if you look at what they had in mind, it was not about, the book was received as a doomsday prophecy. And that framing was very effective in getting it aside, People saying, these guys are doomsdayers, don't listen to them. We will fix the issues, technology, markets, we'll find solutions, etc. You don't have to listen to them. But actually, there was no prophecy in the book at all. That was the attitude, the intent was not to create prophecies. The intent was to open the space of possibilities. Because indeed, so the book was based on a model, a computational model built at MIT under the leadership, initially the leadership of Jay Forrester. So that was the leading edge of systems modeling at the time, and making computational models in the late 60s, early 70s. You can imagine it was not the kind of sport it is now, which very limited computational resources. But the idea was, okay, let's build the model of the world, 5 variables, which are these ones. So very, very global, very simplistic, needless to say, and about, the question of so we create a model and we contrast that with the data we have until now to see if it fits well. And then we use that model to extrapolate different scenarios, many different scenarios, 13 of them in the future, and see what happens. And in different scenarios, many of them were leading to this. This is the business as usual, the standard run in the jargon of The Limits to Growth. And that's indeed collapse of human civilizations due to a combination of 2 factors, the exhaustion of non-renewable resources and growing pollution. And many other scenarios were saying that, but not all. And this is why I said the big message of the book, not perceived at the time, or maybe interestingly, not perceived by people who had some vested interests in not perceiving it, was that we can change, we can learn, and we can change the course. And that's very obvious in this one, the SW scenario, lower right, is the stabilized world scenario. So these are different, 4 of the scenarios in the original book, on business as usual. Business as usual 2 is what if we have underestimated the total amount of resources. So basically taking as an assumption that natural resources would be the double of the initial estimate. And you see that unless our model changes, our model of production, exploitation, and waste, unless that changes, having twice as many resources doesn't change the consequences, the collapse. It moves the collapse. And even CT is about improving the technologies we're using, but even that is not necessarily leading to avoiding collapse. But that collapse could be avoided. There were some scenarios in which there would be stabilization of total population, industrial output, etc. That part, as I said, was unheard. And still today, you know, it continues to be a controversial book. Because this idea of, oh, these guys are I mean, many people, I hear many times the sentence, but the Club of Rome was wrong. You know, they predicted the end of oil and they were wrong. Which is interesting again, because we never predicted anything, and in particular, not the end of oil. So we cannot be wrong on something that we didn't say. But we are assimilated to, you know, to ideas which we didn't say because of, oh, what they are saying is uncomfortable to address. Actually, there have been a lot of work on assessing, okay, that's what the scenarios were saying in 1972, but where are we now compared to those scenarios? And one attempt was done in 2013, you know, with the results that, oh, things are going pretty much as the business as usual scenario was showing. And the most recent and very competent one, analysis was done by Gaia Harrington, who's now also a member of the club. She took all the data, she's a specialist, she's a data analyst, so she did a great job in compiling data, and this has been done, published 2 years ago. And comparing the World 3 is the name of the model of the limits of growth, the different scenarios with the empirical data, to conclude that, yeah, we are still in the business as usual, close to the business as usual scenario. And to conclude what she says here, growth can no longer be humanity's ultimate goal, which of course is a very strong statement. And when she says growth, when we're talking about growth and limits to growth, we're talking growth in the sense of material consumption, of this idea that human well-being is necessarily associated to ever-growing levels of material consumption. And you can have other perspectives of growth in more humanistic ways. Growth as individuals, growth as creativity. I usually say we have to shift from freedom as consumption. We're free to consume as much as we want, provided that we have the money to do that, to freedom as creativity, which is a completely different concept of freedom and of growth. But then the kind of growth we're talking about, the kind of material growth, shouldn't be the goal, you know, and we should have a more ambitious and mature aim, you know, provide enough for each in a way that can last. So regarding, you know, the book, that's what the book said, how it was received and where we are now, you know, and this is very recent work, you know, of assessing the value of the book in the context of today. Regarding other perspectives on the same topic, people have been trying to assess, you know, this matter of what about human development, quote unquote, whatever that means, and the conditions of the planet in which we live, and in particular the conditions of finiteness of the planet. And so my colleague who lives here in Oakland is Mathis Wackernagel, Swiss. Very quick. Thank you.
Make sure the clicker's still works. Can you try out the?
Yeah.
Okay.
A Swiss scholar, but who lives in Oakland, together with Bill Rees, another colleague, they developed the concept of ecological footprint. And they created the Global Footprint Network. You know, there's a lot of stuff you can look at, and basically their data are available open access on their website. And I think it's a very, even if simplistic, they developed a very provocative way to address that question of how much material prosperity can we afford in a finite planet by using this idea of what is our ecological footprint, especially visualized in number of planets we need to keep our lifestyle. And projecting that against the Human Development Index is something developed by the UN, and a mix of different indicators, mixing GDP per capita, but also health and educational indicators in the different countries. And this is what we see. You know, each dot is a country, you know, in this map. The green rectangle is the sustainable development area where you have high levels of human development and low levels of ecological footprint, or let's say levels of ecological footprint compatible with the fact that we have only one planet. And there is no one country inside. Some countries, the ones in the square, you know, Philippines, Jamaica, Ecuador, Cuba, etc., are close, are in the borders of the sustainable development rectangle, but what is particularly, but basically the countries with high levels of human development as measured by this index are high or very high ecological footprints. So you have there in blue variants of dark blue North America and the EU. North America is much worse than the EU in ecological footprint, but we are not good either. Some people think that Nordic countries in Europe are, you know, the reference for a sustainable future. Think again, their ecological footprints are very, very high. You know, much lower than in the US for sure, but very high. And at the same time, countries with low levels of ecological footprint have also low levels of HDI. And if you look at the dynamic, how the countries evolve, because you can do that, you know, how are the dots moving? So, for instance, taking a very relevant example, which is China, you know, you would see that China has actually done, you know, the evolution avoids the rectangle of sustainable development, going from low HDI, low footprint to much higher HDI, but also at a much higher footprint. So again, this is simplistic. This is not telling the whole truth for sure, but this is in a way the way to provoke, again, to ask better questions. And the question here is, or one of the questions which comes from here is that the pathways to sustainable development, whatever that is, and we don't know yet, let's make it clear, you know, do we know what is sustainable development? We don't know in practical terms. We can define that as, you know, this is what I do, equitable human well-being within a healthy biosphere. So levels of well-being for humans, but also for non-humans, for all living beings, as part of the same, not as two separate dimensions. But it looks like this will require, I mean, it will certainly require different pathways. So for countries, as my colleague and friend Kate Rayworth says, you know, with the donut economics, she says, well, there are no developed countries. Forget about developed and developing, which, by the way, is, of course, neo-colonial or neo-colonial framing. But she says there are no developed countries because all countries are far from this idea of the sustainable future. And for some countries, the matter will be about how do we improve well-being for humans significantly while we don't grow in terms of ecological footprint. For others, it's the opposite, sort of, which is how do we decrease radically the level of footprint while not degrading dramatically the levels of well-being, you know? So that's the part of the complex equation. There are other, I will not go into details with this, but there are other ways of seeing the same, you know, that there is a sort of threshold under which, you know, levels of well-being do not significantly improve. And there is a lot of literature on that, how in the industrialized countries, the levels of well-being have not improved overall in societies since the 70s, in spite of the growth in GDP, etc., because the growth of inequality has been huge, while the ecological footprint has grown a lot, you know. So this dilemma is there. And this dilemma is now being recognized by many more people, I would say. Starting in a significant example of something which is changing, the perspective which is changing is what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, was saying and is saying now. So I attended this event in Lisbon in 2017. And he said this, you know, basically was saying, well, everything is going well, you know, development, technology, science, globalization, etc., with some collateral damage. And I almost jumped in my seat when I heard collateral damage, climate change and the rise of inequality. How can you, but you see the framing, right? Everything is going well. And yes, we have collateral damage that we will fix with technology. This was very much a digital technology thing, you know. So of course, that was what the audience, most of the audience would love to hear, that technology would fix the collateral damage. 3 years later, only 3 years later, and the world has not, in objective terms, if you wish, the world has not changed so much. He was saying this. yeah, indeed, you can. And if you follow what he's saying, I mean, you can see that he's being very, very radical in his statements, you know. So humanity is waging war on nature, and this is a suicide. So how do we deal with this very contradictory situation in which, from many points of view, you could say, oh, humanity is thriving, having more and more material development, and actually hundreds of millions of people in most of the world going out of poverty, whatever that means, you know, particularly due to the impulse of China, but not only. So thriving at the same time, and literacy and the status of women changing, even with a lot of backlash, but still overall going in the right direction. And at the same time, we're committing suicide. How do we live with that dilemma? So, of course, what did happen between November 2017 and December 2020? The pandemic. I was discussing with Tim, how is our evolution of the Club of Rome, message of the Club of Rome perceived nowadays? And for a number of reasons, I will get into that. I think we have much more visibility now. But I'm sure it's not only our effort, it's the fact that some events, and particularly the pandemic, has opened many eyes on the reality of collapse. Collapse not as an abstract concept, but collapse as a very practical thing which can happen like that, you know, from one day to the next. And that's interesting. I think it contributed definitely to a shift of not only the pandemic, of course. I mean, we are in polycrisis, you know, the crises are accumulating, and they don't go away, you know, any of them. So this is our conviction, is that this is where we are, facing self-inflicted existential challenges. We need to go towards that very abstract definition, but still saying something, you know, of equitable human well-being within a healthy biosphere, together, not separately. And we don't know how to make it. So I used to provoke my audience with this picture without saying anything, just to see if people recognize something in here, to describe where we are. So who do you think is this girl? Sorry? Yeah. Alice through the looking glass. And it's interesting because people recognize this, so which says something about the, not the universality for sure, but how popular is Tale of Alice, or the Tale of Alice. But I use this as a provocation to say this is where we are. We're like Alice going through the looking glass, crossing a threshold, and not knowing what is on the other side of the threshold, or as much uncomfortable as it could be, because people would, even people convinced of we are not in the right place, we are not doing the right things, immediately they ask for, but what is the roadmap? What is the, you know, what is the plan? How do we get to where we, how do we define where we want to go, and the plan in 10 steps to get there? Very much part of linear thinking. So we don't know. And the fact is that this comes back to the history of the Club of Rome, because we realized that issue very early. And particularly, again, Aurelio Peccei realized that, okay, we have sold millions of books of the limits to growth, but he understood that this was not going to change the course, in particular, the political course of things. To a certain extent, we had a very naive theory of change, if you wish, at the time, which was, let's go, okay, we have this scientific evidence, which was contested by many people, but not really not in terms of scientific evidence. Controversy did not come from, you know, legitimate scientific debate. It came from other places, you know. We have this scientific evidence, let's go to the politicians and they will understand what we are talking about, and then they will realize they have to change, you know. Yes, very naive, I know. But at the time it could be, and actually what happened, the interesting thing is that it looked like it was working. Because initially, because of the success of the book, but also because at the times, there were many more people open, at least again in the industrialized world, there were many more people in the political space willing to listen to that than the contrary, for sure in Europe, but also in the US. Jimmy Carter was president, and in his presidency was talking about this, you know. And then, of course, came Thatcher and Reagan, and that changed completely the political course. And then from that moment, we were very much ignored, you know. And Reagan said in one public discourse, there are no limits to growth, literally. Great for the Club of Rome, you know, we're part of political discourses, but not so great for humanity, you know, ignoring the issue. So what Aurelio promoted was a deep reflection on what are our own limitations to change, to learn. And he promoted the publication of this book, No Limits to Learning, that almost nobody knows, but it's an incredible book, you know, which is accessible online in open access. I mean, you find it easily. To address this matter of the human gap, he called the human gap the difference between the way we, our capacity to act and our capacity to understand and take care of the consequences of our actions. And he promoted the idea that the challenge we face is a challenge of learning, but learning in the sense of changing, not in the sense of understanding something at the rational, conscious level, This is why my interventions, I often use this learning what we already know. Because there are plenty of things that we know, some of them since millennia, some since decades, but we don't want to learn them. And in 1984, his very last book was a book of conversations with Daisaku Ikeda, a Japanese Buddhist philosopher, talking about that, and asking for a human revolution, not a political one, a cultural and a revolution in mentalities, in mindsets. So that was already there 40 years ago. And what we are trying to do in the Club of Rome of today is to live up to this legacy. So we had 5 years ago, the 50th anniversary of the club, and we decided to change everything to keep our mission alive, change everything to keep the essence of the club and its mission alive. So we, among other things, we elected 2 ladies co-presidents. That was the first time in the history of the club. We had already a tradition of co-presidencies, but never had a woman leading the club. We have 2 very strong ones with whom I'm very happy to work. And but it was part of a wider program of let's go outside. Let's go out of the ivory tower. Let's become a catalyst of activities, of projects, of programs, platform, and with a new programmatic agenda and new proactivity and the willingness to partner with other organizations. And we created an operational structure with these 5 topics that you see here. Planetary emergency, now it's almost standard. Everybody is recognizing that, starting with the UN Secretary General, but not in 2018. Not yet understood at the time, Reframing economics, rethinking finance, the words say what we are talking about. Rethinking finance is a lot about changing finance. So what kind of financial system would we need in a sustainable world? Youth leadership and intergenerational dialogue is very much about how does the Club of Rome, which is not a youth organization, far from that, how do we engage in meaningful conversations with youth and with the role of youth for the future? And emerging new civilizations, which is the one I co-lead with Rampele, is about the idea that the new is probably emerging in places that are not visible. There might be a lot of seeds of the new, of these. And well, it's about the idea that we are in a shift of civilization, nothing less than that. Because actually we need to find a new way of being in the world, of relating to others, to humans, but especially to non-humans, and also another way to relate with time, taking care of what we have also for future generations. Very difficult, very different framing, epistemology, if you wish. So it's 2 things at the same time. Is we are going towards new civilizations. Usually we put the S in parentheses because some people say new civilization in singular. I'm of the opinion that they will be different, several civilizations. And emerging because let's look at what is emerging. Weaving with multiple threads, which is I talked about the uniqueness of the Club of Rome in its perspective, particularly the systemic perspective. But actually, if you look at what we are doing and with whom we are doing that, you can find these multiple threads. So global modeling is for sure in the history of the club, and it's still there. But there is a very strong orientation of humanism and everything which is related to that. We have access to policymakers now that the world is crumbling more easily than before. Sorry for that. And we build on many different schools of systems thinking. Systems thinking is a wide space where you can find many different things. But we have inside some systems thinkers, and one of them very Californian, because she's the daughter of Gregory Bateson, and so we have a strong connection with the Batesonian school of thinking. Actually, the granddaughter of Gregory Bateson also lives in Oakland. So for you to know, that's interesting. So, and also we have inside the club practitioners in the world of business and finance, but also in the world of education, science, civil society. You know? So we try to combine these multiple threads, which is of course a base. When we talk about multi-inter-transdisciplinarity in the context of higher education and research, we love to talk about that, but at the same time, we know how difficult it is in practical terms to practice that. The same, even more, we have even wider diversity of people, but that's what makes things exciting, of course. So last year we published 2 books, Limits and Beyond, which is what ultimately originated this session, which was this question on where was the limits to growth standing then, and what was the reception, what happened since then, and where are we now, and what does the future look like, but not in terms of describing future scenarios or anything like that, rather in terms of what do we need to learn, what we already know. You know, that's the title of my chapter at the end of the book. This is co-written with 21 colleagues, most of them colleagues in the Club of Rome, but not only. And Earth for All is a different kind of book, because this is the part, you know, we have sort of 2 faces or 2 legs. One is more about the face looking towards policymakers. That's Earth for All, identifying 5 areas of policies and a number of policies in those 5 areas where we think policy change is needed, is required to go somewhere else, not to go to the suicide of humanity. So, and the 5 are the empowerment of women and girls, energy transition, regenerative agriculture, inequality, addressing inequality with strong measures, and addressing poverty with a model well suited for many countries in most of the world. So that's, if you wish, what we would like a policymaker to read, Earth for All. I will not go into details on that. And this is more about kind of things we can work on together, and we will discuss later in the workshop. This idea of how do we learn what we already know. Know again since millennia, because it's also about traditional ecological thinking, the thinking and the cultures of originary peoples. And with this idea of opening the space of possibilities and making, bringing tribute to some outstanding people like Donella Meadows and Lynn Margulis. You know? So in 2023, and I will, this is the very last part of my talk, with all that background, part of what we are doing, and this is particularly the part in which I am personally involved, is asking these questions. Again, trying to ask better questions. Is a human revolution in the sense of Peccei of 84 emerging? Is cultural change, the 2 legs are policy change, cultural change, and we think that policy change will not happen if cultural change does not happen. And in a way, vice versa, if cultural change happens, well, policy change becomes much, much easier. But how do you because we know how to try to do policy change. You know, you go with the usual instruments, you go to policymakers, you try to mobilize people to create political movement around some topic, etc., etc., etc. Okay, not guaranteed that that leads to actual transformation, as you know. But how do you create cultural change? That's an even much bigger question on which you are probably better informed than myself, because this is the perspective, precisely the perspective of humanities and to a certain extent social sciences. How could we help? And we had the funny idea to say, okay, because in our approach, reconnecting with the knowledge, with the knowledge in particular of the originary peoples is important, what if we build on the ancient traditions, which of course modern chemistry has put aside, you know, but there are still, if you look at the idea that there are four basic elements, it makes a lot of sense because these four elements are absolutely required for life, which is the fifth, you know, and a mysterious one. In different traditions, the Chinese have their own, so they have five basic elements, not four, because they add metal. But the sixth, what would play the role of the sixth is qi, you know, vital energy. So this is the fifth element that we adopted as the name of our program in the current program in the Club of Rome that I lead. You have we recently launched our website, so you can have a look at that and discover what we do. And what we try to do is to convene conversations for this, you know. Inquire on the transformative potential of learning for collective action, but not of teaching, of learning. We're not here to teach people what they have to do, but rather to help creating the conditions for people to get out of their helplessness. And this is so connected with some of the things that are in the history of humanity, but also in the history of the Club of Rome, because our co-president Mampela Rampele created, when she was in her 20s, together with Steve Biko and a few others, they created the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. By the way, exactly the same year. So everything happened in 1968, as you certainly know. They created the Black Consciousness movement at the same time that the Club of Rome was created. With this approach of course, it was political, it was against apartheid, but it was a cultural movement rooted in ideas of self-liberation, liberation of minds, rooted in pedagogies of liberation, I would call them, you know, things that had been for many years around, like Paulo Freire in Brazil, and promoting social movements of that kind, of promoting the conditions for cultural change. So, and of course, connecting with their roots, their own cultural roots, Ubuntu African cultures, you know. So we're also building on that experience, that concrete experience, and the experience trying to learn from the experiences of many people around in many communities, trying to build their own pathways, trying to learn and acting by themselves, and making this completely impossible mission of respecting at the same time all cultures and threads of knowledge, as much ancient wisdom as modern science. So that's what we are trying to do, you know, shifting, creating a learning alliance. And we have now, you can see on the website, we are working with many partners on many initiatives, some of them of global nature, like the Bridges Coalition for Sustainability Science, which is a coalition of organizations, most of them research institutes and universities, trying to bring humanities to the fore and to the core of sustainability discussion. And you, I mean, you are more than welcome to participate in that in whatever way you would like, because that's trying to create change also at the level of global agendas of how research and education higher education are framed, and research agendas are framed, you know. And it's something supported by UNESCO, sorry, the UN Agency for Education and Science, you know. Just finishing in this fifth element context, what are we trying? Well, some untypical things. Going beyond the concept of stakeholder engagement. Convening people as people, you know why? Because no time anymore for stakeholders or for stakeholders conversations, because all stakes are at risk. Stakeholder engagement means everybody comes with an agenda of existing interests, and then the game becomes conversation of how much of the status quo can we preserve. The exercise we have to do now is of a completely different nature. From teaching to learning, pretty clear. From colonial mindset to self-organization. So connecting, of course, with the thinking of, and that's a complex issue, I know, but the thinking about decolonial thinking, overcoming colonial mindset in all its forms. From the idea that we live in a world of scarcity, and then to address that, the better is to compete and to dispossess people, yeah, to a world of, that's one of the things which really surprised me when trying to understand a bit better African cultures, that in the original cultures of Africa, abundance is granted, not scarcity. And the first time I heard that, I was shocked from my own framework of European culture, you know? And close to Africa, because so how these people could have the feeling that, you know, life provides, you know, that there is abundance, because from the typical developmental framework, we think that, oh, they are poor, and we have to, in the best case, we have to help them to develop themselves. Well, they have a completely different approach. Also shifting from problem solution to dissonances, and to understanding dissonances, because you know what we have been sensing and organizing particular meetings with people, as people coming from different sectors, but not public meetings. Some of them are more or less public meetings, but in which we try to ensure that there is dialogue, conversations. Others are more private, and what we sense today, that there is a lot of dissonance between the official discourse and what people feel, including among top-level decision makers. And what can we do about that? You know, I will leave this maybe better for the workshop discussion. We have also sensed this very strongly, you know, the idea that we have to recognize the autonomy, the radical autonomy, but also interdependency of all human beings, you know. And that probably the exercise in which we have to engage at this stage is an exercise of what we call mutual transition. And even more than that, transition is a soft word for what we have to do, I think. And this is related with our approach to systemic change. I think it's, in my view, it's evident that we need a paradigm shift in our culture, in the ways we make well-being in materialized, you know, either we go on with this, the easy way, which is to keep going, to keep thinking that well-being comes from ever-growing levels of material accumulation, or we find other ways to reconceive what is well-being. And that's a big systemic change, and this will not be painless. I mean, in our personal lives, I don't know all of you, but whenever we shift our patterns or patterns of behavior, this is not a painless process. This is learning. Learning is not painless. And it requires, first of all, a situation of criticality. We have it. Tensions accumulated up to the point of fractures. This often happens through the self-organization of an emergence of new seeds, from places, untypical, unexpected places, typically from marginal places which are marginal, which are not at the core of the existing systems, and which go into resonance and create something new. And we are using of course, some metaphors. These are metaphors coming from biology, pollination, symbiosis, and ultimately mutual metamorphosis, which is quite a different approach compared to the idea that we have the solutions, somebody has the solutions, and has to convince the rest of society that these are the right solutions, or the rest of the world, or whatever. We think in the fifth element, we think that sort of confrontational approach and very binary approach and linear approach of problem solutions, and these are the good solutions, but oh, by the way, half of the population does not believe in these solutions, but we have to convince them. This is not the right approach. We need to have a much more sophisticated process of transformation, which we call mutual metamorphosis. But I've gone over time already by far, so I will just stop here and thank you and say that willingly or not, you are already part of the fifth element, because this is, what is the fifth element? Well, we don't know. It's life, So you are already part of it, but then if you want to participate in whatever way, you are more than welcome. Thank you so much for your attention.
Carlos, would you like to take that microphone and have a seat up front?
Yeah.
And so hello. Hi, so do we have questions from the audience? Okay.
I guess it's more of a comment. Something you said earlier reminded me about time. Reminded me of a quote by Samuel Beckett that habit is the cancer of time, I believe it is. And to me, that suggests a picture of inertia, right? Habits lead to kind of inertia. And so you're talking about kind of a revolutionary transformations. It seems to me one of the main obstacles would be, habit at a massive scale, people's habits, what they're accustomed to. And, I think of just at a micro level, something's broken in your house and you're like, yeah, I'll get to it later. Meanwhile, it could be having these systemic effects, on heating, et cetera. And just bring that up to scale with the planet. Well, the planet's broken, but that'll be done. So there's this kind of habit, we're talking about habit at scale, or this kind of inertia. And I think maybe this links to something said earlier about the importance of time, the transformation of time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, a lot of things. Yes. I think a lot of things about that, but and so we could elaborate a lot about this aspect of the relationship to time. I think is the most critical one, and generally the most ignored, at least in Western culture. Asian cultures have a different approach to that, but because the relationship to time is also a relationship to death, and that's where and the relationship to fear. Ultimately, all fears come back to our fear of death and how we deal with that. And inertia is very much about the fear of changing, because we know we generally underestimate the risk of not changing. We overestimate the risk of changing. So that keeps us in the inertia in which we are. This is why we say criticality. My last slide was, the initial starting point is criticality. And this is not only more than a metaphor, because some of the people who have been in the global world in the past have analyzed, how systems change of patterns through, for instance, the theory of chaos in dynamical systems. How changes of configuration happen at critical points, where there is no way for the system but to change, no way to stay there, because the tensions are accumulating so much that it cannot stay there. And the point is, okay, then you have in the bifurcation point, you have many different options, and some of them, of course, are worse. Changing, yes, but taking one direction. Well, that's what we see today. Tensions are accumulating, changing we are doing and not necessarily going in the more positive direction. Many of them are looking back to the past in a way, and looking back to things which are not good at all. So yes, inertia is critical, relationship to time is critical, but this also says that we have to try to learn from people who have no other option than to change, who are not in inertia, because they are under constant pressure from reality. In December last year, we organized the annual conference of global warming in Costa Rica, and the intention was to listen to Latin Americans. And one of the lessons we got from there was almost literally said by the participant. He said, you are coming from Europe and North America, etc. You're talking about collapse, still in a way of avoiding collapse in the future. But you know what? In Latin America, we live collapse, not a future state. And then had the idea, oh, maybe Latin America is actually ahead of us, and we have to learn from them how to overcome inertia.
We have another question here, folks.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very thought-provoking, also provocative. So
That was the
yeah. So I want to premise I guess I want to make maybe two comments and maybe seek your reaction on that. You said early on that one of the worst kinds of blindness we have is what we choose to see. I would take it, actually, there's a different arm of it. All people all over the world, all nations have had different trajectories of development. And it has been often stained with things like colonialism, wars, even pandemics and so forth. That causes blind spots, not because somebody wanted it, but it ended up being inflicted on them. So oftentimes we see countries in the world, large swaths of the world, that are still reeling from effects of colonialism or certain meta movements that occurred on that, even after the colonial powers leave, the imprints are still left. So it is not that somebody may not choose to see, or somebody may not want to change, but we have to be mindful about what situation any party is in before we expect a change. Which brings me to my second comment, and that's a really big one. In all the courses I'm teaching this semester, one of them is sustainable development, another one is environmental justice, another one is, the impact of globalization and its footprint for people and so forth. So a lot of what you said today is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, and having very engaging conversations with my students in all my classes. We also have to be mindful, like you gave the example of Latin America. Whenever we change, we don't leave our Eurocentrism. And we don't have patience with those who have another mindset, because they are still reeling from the effects of these last, 2000 years of whatever we have done on the planet. So even when we expect a change, we kind of do it from, I'll give you an example. United Nations released development goals in 1970. Then it released Millennium Development Goals in 2000. So, kind of the sort of a time frame you are talking about. The wording is really different. In 2000, they talk about gender equality and sustainable development. Really, it's redressing, you're kind of resetting things, and you're getting out of your perspective, which has been defined, I want to say, the Abrahamic era. I mean, and sort of the mindset that if the West or Europe is not comfortable or has not encountered it, it must not be correct. And sadly, or not so surprisingly, even nations that are not European or North American still subscribe to that, and that is one effect of colonialism. That's I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to give you one example of a reading we encountered in one of my classes. And so this particular author, who is a fierce proponent of environmental justice and sustainable development, in one of his papers, he wrote that, and we are so in touch with the importance of looking after our planet that he gave 3 examples. 2 of it, he says Botswana gives rights to nature. And he says in India, the Ganges is called Mother Ganges. Now, I was a little troubled because I had to actually teach this. And my students were kind of like, they took this on, and we had lots of fun with this in class, because it kind of, Botswana gave nature rights before United Nations existed, and before we understood that there was something like sustainable development that needed to be done. In India, Ganges is called Mother Ganges since the time Sanskrit was the world's spoken language. So, the documentation is like 6,000 years before that you call Ganges. When you call something mother, it's not a thing. Just think about what you would call a mother. It's not something you need, something that needs you. The relationship is very deep, and you can't be without it. Just think so one of the things my students came up with, and I'll bring this up in some of our workshops, is that they said, how about, because politicians don't listen to parties that don't have stakeholders, that don't vote, why don't we give rights as though corals could vote or trees could vote? What would they vote as? And just to give that as some kind of an awareness as to what a sustainable developed outcome would be. Like, I wanted to know your comments on this. I'm sorry if I took up more time than I mentioned.
Well, my most important comment is that I agree with you on everything.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I could stop there, I subscribe absolutely everything you said, because, and this is a big issue. This is related to don't know if you are attending the workshop later. Is what I call the unreasonable effectiveness of modernity, which is the fact that in spite of the crisis it creates, modernity manages to keep going on by changing whatever needs to change. There is a famous sentence from Tomasi di Lampedusa, that's an Italian writer, you know, his novel about the Italian Revolution in 18, leading to the unity of Italy in 1860. Change everything so that everything stays the same. And what you are saying is that, you know, because yeah, the multilateral world senses that, oh, makes sense now to start talking about the rights of the rivers. And of course, to the originary peoples, we have quite a number of them in the Costa Rica conference. This would be a joke if it was not a tragedy. You know that, now you Westerners, people with this Western way of thinking, you are talking about the rights of rivers. Come on, you invaded the world with the opposite, and now you're realizing that what is natural in our culture. This is why when I said earlier that we already know, I said, well, a lot of what we know that since millennia, maybe tens, thousands of years, in some cases, but definitely since millennia. And we went out, you know, and we decided to neglect all that traditional knowledge and to build something which has been terribly effective. And of course, this is related not only to leadership, but to power. So just to finish, my comment is, have some quotes about power, which are really the first time I heard one person quote is, I was shocked that the idea is powerful. That comes from Karl Deutsch, political scientist from Prague, from Czechia, who ended up living in the US. And he said, power is the ability not to have to learn anything. I was shocked the first time I learned. And then I found very recently in a Nigerian Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian writer, a sentence which starts the same: power is the ability to tell, not only to tell the story of others, but to make it final. You know, the ability to say your story is what I decide it is. So I would say power is the ability not to have to learn anything, except what you need to learn to keep the essential, to keep the power alive. Because we cannot say we are not learning, but we are learning at levels which actually block changing the essence of power.
We have some questions from the chat.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
which our dear Tanya has kindly.
We try to be shorter. Responsible.
No, that's okay. So our colleague in Boston, Jenny Stevens, who's actually not in Boston at the moment, but she asked, quote, much of what we do in universities perpetuates the status quo, both in our teaching and in our technocratic research. Do you have any suggestions or examples of higher education institutions that are embracing the paradigm shift that you're proposing?
I don't have a reference of look at these places, but I can tell that this is very much why we are engaged in some of the initiatives I mentioned, particularly this Regions Coalition, from the perspective that we try to be the agent provocateur, saying, you know, from outside, because we are not a higher education institution, saying, you know, this is about the paradigm shift in epistemology, very much. So the epistemology of under which universities are built today is serving the perpetuation of the same epistemology, absorbing parts of, absorbing some ideas, but then keeping them or absorbing them only in as much they serve the perpetuation of the epistemology, and then everything else, you know. So it's my reflection is that unless organizations, not only universities, organizations in general, businesses, governments, etc., take these challenges we have been talking about as existential to themselves, to their existence, things will not change. Because to a large extent, a lot of institutions, which of course are, and we are, the Club of Rome is one of them, we are privileged institutions leading in industrialist countries. You might have noticed that I don't use global north and global south because this is misleading. It looks like there are two halves of the world. There are not two halves of the world. There is most of the world where it is, and you know, the other part, the industrialized countries on the elites wherever they are, you know, and provided that we don't, if we talk from institutions, privileged enough to going on talking about rather than living the changes, the change will not happen with the required depth.
Roseanne Stupinski has a question.
No one resign.
She wants to know, why are you using for the term for the change that is needed, metamorphosis rather than transformation? Why metamorphosis rather than transformation?
That's a good question, and to be honest, I'm just starting to use that term very recently, since days actually. But there are two reasons here. One is that metamorphosis has a stronger, even a stronger emotional meaning. You know, from caterpillar to butterfly, that's the usual metaphor. And that's, I think that resonates more. Transformation is a big ambiguous term. I think we need to have something stronger than that, coming from life, you know, from the fact that in life there are metamorphoses. And the other reason is because I'm determined to build on some ideas which have been investigated by modern biologists. But again, it's about coming back to ancient wisdom. And I'm thinking in particular of Lynn Margulis and her idea of symbiosis and symbiogenesis as essential mechanisms of evolution, biological evolution. And symbiogenesis seems pretty good metaphor to be used because we're talking about different species co-evolving. And if you bring this to the social domain, it's not different species, but still it's about this mutual transformation is into something else. Because we don't know if we are what we're talking about when we talk about new civilizations, what will they be? How much of that, how much of modernity will we keep in that? How much of becoming indigenous again, which is sometimes evolved, will they be? We don't know. And there are new synthesis. And that new synthesis, if it is a synthesis, that will be a symbiogenesis. But symbiogenesis, of course, is a very technical word. So this is why it took metamorphosis.
I think the biological metaphor is sufficient to be in of itself. Given what you were discussing, do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, I think we're out of time. So thank you so much, Carlos, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was great.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Yeah.